afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you all had a lovely lunch and managed to get a cup of tea. Welcome to this afternoon session of this year's SEAI National Energy Research and Policy Conference. My name is Claire Guy and I'm a Programme Executive here at SEAI within the Research Development and Demonstration Programme team. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this closing session of our flagship annual research conference, where as we've been discussing, achieving sustainable energy security. So far today, we've heard from many leading experts discuss their work. We have heard from academics and researchers, policymakers, and representatives from community organisations. Our final session today will focus on future perspectives on energy security and what we can learn from others in international and national research for further insights towards achieving sustainable energy security. A reminder to please continue to use the Q&A function if you have any questions at any stage. This session will begin with 2 presentations, after which there will be time for a Q&A session. We will have a further presentation and then we'll pause for a short break before continuing to our closing panel discussion chaired by Jim Shear, Head of Data and Insight at SEAI. So I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Youmina Saheb to discuss energy sufficiency and the future of energy security. Youmina is a lecturer and researcher at Sciences Po in Paris, a lead author of the IPCC report on climate change mitigation, and a senior fellow at OpenEXP. Prior to this position, Youmina was a senior research fellow at the University of Munster and previously a senior researcher at the University of Lausanne. In 2018, Youmina was the head of Energy Efficiency Unit at the Energy Charter Secretariat. And beyond that, she's had many other positions. So I welcome you to go to the guest speaker page and take a look at Youmina's bio. So over to you now, Youmina.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to contribute to your event and to discuss energy sufficiency and the future of energy security. So energy sufficiency, I don't know how people are familiar with the concept. It's not a new concept. It goes back to the Greek civilization, but using energy, applying the sufficiency concept to the energy transition has been done first by Wolfgang Sachs for the energy transition in Germany. For some reason, it did not fly and it did not arrive to the German policies. However, it did cross the French border and it ended in the ears of energy engineers in France who have developed the first energy transition scenario that considers energy sufficiency. In parallel to that, almost the same period in the US, Thomas Prinzon published a comprehensive book about what sufficiency is and for sustainability. And his book goes beyond energy. And you will see in the definition we included in the IPCC report that sufficiency goes beyond energy. But today I will limit the discussion to the energy part of it. And this is where we have more case studies, which is France is the case study for that, because in the French energy transition law from 2015, energy sufficiency is one of the pillars of the energy transition law in France, and it's first sufficiency, then efficiency, and renewables. This is what happened in the Western world. In the other part of the world, long time before Wolfgang Sachs, Thailand in the 70s developed the philosophy for sufficiency economy. This is extremely comprehensive and they considered sufficiency as an important pillar for their development policies. It has been implemented in the 90s, but what has been done in Thailand is not very well known in the Western world. I know that what we have been trained on, most of us, is efficiency. And that's why I try to summarize here the differences between sufficiency and efficiency, because there is confusion even in the literature, even today. And the first one is from Wolfgang Sachs, this German researcher, who is, as I mentioned, the first one to consider sufficiency, to apply sufficiency for the energy transition. And he did put it like that. Sufficiency is about doing the right things, while efficiency is about doing things right. And basically, if you are doing something wrong, right, it will be wrong. It's even worse than if you do nothing. And that's why I did include this one here. And then when you dig deeper to all the literature on sufficiency, you realize that actually sufficiency tackles the causes of the ecological crisis and the climate change crisis, while efficiency works on the symptoms. So when you already have the energy service there, you already have this consumption, and then you try to optimize the energy consumption. Efficiency does not question the energy needs, while sufficiency questions the need. It's about the needs. And then when you question the needs, you might end up with different solutions. So for example, as citizens, we have a mobility need. We don't have a car need. However, given that we have been working mainly on efficiency, so what we have been doing is to improve the efficiency of vehicles and more recently to decarbonize individual cars through electric vehicles. While actually, if you look at it from sufficiency perspective, so the question is, you have mobility need, and the answer is the question is, how can I meet the mobility needs of my citizens? And the answer is not always through private cars. And this is why sufficiency, much more than efficiency, requires strong policy intervention, because sufficiency is, as you will see in the definition, it's all the policies and the measures that triggers the social norms that will lead later on to better use of resources. One of the challenges of sufficiency is that it requires a system approach, while we have been all trained in silos and in more linear more linear approach, and that's why efficiency, I think, is much more successful, or has been the first thing we have done was efficiency instead of sufficiency, because sufficiency requires us to make an effort to get out of our silos and to work in interdisciplinary with other disciplines. And sufficiency compared to efficiency is about absolute figures. So for example, the floor area per capita for each of us, and not about, like in the case of efficiency, the floor, the final energy consumption per square meter. Because if you have the final energy consumption as the main indicator that you are tracking, so in the case of EU countries, what we see is that since we had the EPPD, we have an improvement in the efficiency. The final energy consumption per square meter has went down. However, the overall consumption of our houses, for example, increased, because in the meantime, the floor area per capita has increased. So if you don't have both indicators, then you end up in a situation where we are today, where despite 30 years of energy efficiency and climate policies, climate mitigation policies, our emissions are not going down. And given that sufficiency is about policy intervention, upfront policy intervention, so it's much easier to have the cost of sufficiency measures shared by or the whole society, and by considering the equity dimension. So sufficiency policies are not regressive policies; they are progressive policies, while efficiency policies are very often regressive policies. So if I take the example of electric vehicles or making your home more efficient, so we have incentives in all our countries. However, we do know that these incentives are not for the low income families cannot access these incentives. So and this is one major issue today that we face, and this is why we have the concept of the just transition. Can you please go to the next slide? And this is how for the first time in the IPCC report we included the sufficiency concept. Unfortunately, it was included mainly in the building chapter. However, we do have a definition. This is a definition that comes from this commentary published in Buildings and Cities. But we do have this definition included in the summary for policymakers. And sufficiency, after reviewing all the literature that was available until the end of 2021, is actually a set of policy measures and daily practices. It's articulated around 4 pillars. The first one is that it's policies and daily practices. So it's not behavior change. There is a misunderstanding, for example, like in France, where it's the only, to my knowledge, it's the only OECD country where sufficiency is considered as one of the pillars of the energy transition. However, the focus of the government has been on behavior change of individuals, while as individuals, we are locked in the solutions that have been put in place by the industry based on the policies that have been agreed. And that's why it's first the policies, And these policies will trigger the daily practices that will lead to behavior change. Good illustration of that is, for example, the use biking, of cycling in our cities. So we first had, if you have a city that does not have safe biking lines, it's unlikely that people will bike. Then people will mainly use their cars. However, if you put in place policies to create safe biking lines, then biking is re-becoming, because it was in the past norm, is re-becoming a norm in our cities, thanks to the policies. And then these policies, what they do is that they avoid the demand for all natural resources, not just energy. It's about all natural resources, and it's about avoiding upfront this demand. It's not about using this demand, these natural resources in the most efficient way, like in the case of efficiency. And then the third component is the fact that these policies are about delivering well-being for all. So sufficiency is about first protecting the most vulnerable ones. It's about equity and access to decent living standards as it is defined in the modern world. And all this should be done within planetary boundaries. So we do make a reference to planetary boundaries instead of the carbon budget. It was discussed, a bit challenged at the IPCC level, because the IPCC is mainly about carbon, because planetary boundaries, in the case of planetary boundaries, climate change is one out of the 9 planetary boundaries. And this avoids us making mistakes in the solutions that we provide. Can you go please to the next slide? So I brought to you 2 examples of what sufficiency could change in terms of energy security. So there has been a project, an EU project, funded project to design scenarios based on sufficiency. And this is the result for Ireland, actually, for residential buildings only. So you see the energy consumption for different fuels. And then you see that over time, if you have sufficiency, the fossil fuel will disappear completely. So the question of energy security will no longer something we will be studying, because we would have eliminated the causes of energy security, or the lack of energy security. Can you go to the next slide, please? And then what are among the implications when you consider sufficiency? So due to the energy crisis, we know that we have an increase of people facing energy poverty in our countries. And of course, energy poverty is due to the low efficiency level of our buildings, but it is also due to, for example, the way gas, now stay with this slide, the next one. The way gas and electricity prices are set in our countries. These are gas prices per different component for different consumption bands in Ireland, based on the Eurostat data. And what we see is that the first consumption band, the price of the unit kilowatt hour consumed is much higher than in the latest consumption band. What does that mean? It means that with the current energy prices setting, we do encourage our citizens to consume more, because it's cheaper if you consume more. But the worst thing is that we do not protect those who are the most vulnerable ones, those who consume the least. And if we would have had sufficiency policies, so we would design our energy prices, we would require through policies to design our energy prices differently. And this means by keeping in mind this equity consideration, but also by if you do it like we are doing it today, so we will increase emissions, while if we do the opposite, we will reduce emissions. So to summarize, sufficiency, even if you look at it only from energy sufficiency perspective, goes far beyond just energy policies. And it's about first equity and about protecting the most vulnerable ones. And in the last months, I am more, I think that the environmental impact, reducing emissions of through sufficiency is actually a co-benefit from all the other policies that sufficiency requires us to look to. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Yamina. That was great. Next, we have Dr. Matthias Suda, who is a Senior Policy Officer at the European Commission. Matthias will be discussing collaborative research for sustainable energy security. Matthias began his career at the Ministry of Economic Affairs in the Netherlands as a specialist in international research cooperation. And then in 2008, he joined the European Commission in DG Research and Innovation. And I'm very glad and delighted to welcome him here today. So over to you, Matthias.
Thank you, Claire, for the kind introduction. Happy to share some thoughts, indeed, about collaborative research, but also, in fact, to the previous speaker. One of the remarks was you have to take the right decisions. You really have to think to do it well. And within the European Commission, we're discussing this also regularly, and saying, okay, you have to do science-based decision-making. You have to know all the parameters in that respect. The previous speaker was also talking about a vision, but what is the vision? And then I'm going back, indeed, what we have as European Commission. And it started already 4 years ago with the Green Deal, where we really had a vision of decarbonizing to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 completely, to go to zero target or net zero target, but also to build a circular economy in the same time. It was also mentioned, think about the resources which we are using. Are we using the right resources? Are we using the right materials? We can push maybe a new technology, but maybe it's built on the wrong materials. Maybe we don't have sufficient materials for that to deploy it on a very large scale. Now, based on these targets which we have been setting for 2050, we have to be very practical as well and think, what should we do now? Okay, let's set then targets for 2030. And for that reason, we had the Fit for 55 package to have already greenhouse gas reductions 55% by 2030. We have been doing some modeling calculations with the Clean Planet for All. What kind of actions, where should we put our efforts in that respect? And that all thinking about the energy system and really thinking it is not just working in silos. You need integration. It is a system approach which is really needed. Looking to cross-cutting aspects. There is no competition between wind and PV, and maybe emerging technology. I know Ireland is also working on ocean energy. Building up a secure system, and that's what we are aiming at. But it's not an easy one. And that means that we have to discuss it. How should it look like? How should we make it happen? We have to inspire each other in that respect. It's a pity that it couldn't be with you. It's online. Normally in the breaks, it's always very good to have a follow-up discussion. What should we do together? And that's also something which we believe as Commission, we have to do the things together. There are some examples on an international level where we do that already. We have the International Energy Agency Technology Collaboration Platforms. I know that Ireland is a very active member there and part in the wind stream, in ocean energy stream, trying to work together with the United States, China, to work on the new technologies, contributing to the new system which we are targeting at. There's also Mission Innovation. Ireland is not a member, but via the EU, the European Commission, represented. Mission Innovation has thinking about green-powered future mission. How should it look like in the future? What kind of new technologies are needed? And how should we develop that? By myself, I'm also director for the Clean Hydrogen Mission. Hydrogen is part of this energy system, also securing maybe intermittency of some of the renewable energy targets. So that these are platforms to inspire and to work together. But we can talk, that's very easy. We are doing this in this conference, but it's also asking for action. And we have to really make this collaboration happen. And that, as European Commission, is why we have as well our Horizon Europe program, for instance, where we are asking already for many years, consortia with industry, research organizations, but also government, but also including citizens, to develop the new technologies from a low TRL to a higher one, and also in fact to commercialization. We have all the funding programs. I think it's really something, and when I speak with the different consortia, they always like that, to have these new ideas, to have these new partnerships on working together, and by building that, the new innovations for the future. It takes time. Sometimes with a new technology, you have to start now to be able to deploy it in 2050. Wind energy systems started already 40, 50 years ago, and now we only have the large-scale deployment. PV, in fact, the same. It's ramping up, which is very good. You really see this change for the good. But maybe we have to increase it even more, and that we, as different countries in Europe, are working more closely together and direct as well our research programs in the right direction. And one of these examples is, in fact, the Clean Energy Transition Partnership, which has been established 2 years ago, and are organizing now calls for joint projects in Europe, but also outside Europe. I have a couple of slides on that. I hope I manage to share them. I hope it's still all good. Wait a minute. And share. Yeah, I hope it's working. Presentation mode, maybe. So this is from the Clean Energy Transition Partnership. Can you see it there? Some feedback would be nice. But the Clean Energy Transition Partnership is really a program of here, I think, sorry. Okay, Clean Energy Transition Partnership. It is a multilateral strategic partnership programs. They're trying to build innovation systems and really have a system approach, transnational, transformative, and support research projects, but also trying to get the knowledge out of it, to share it, and to increase in that respect the impact. This partnership is responding, in fact, to our policies in innovation. And I mentioned already Green Deal 55, but we also have specific strategies which are part of this Green Deal, hydrogen and offshore renewables. This program altogether is a total budget of around 700-800 million for next years, where 200 million have been commissioned. EU, I have to say. The expected outcome is that all the countries, all the participants have, in fact, the same vision, the same directionality, and that the outcomes are used for policy formulation, for climate policy formulation. I think it's very important to get the knowledge retrieved from all the research scientists, but also from the industry together, and to build up a vision for the future. Why a systematic transition? By where we see as an outcome a building block to, in fact, the zero emission energy system which we are targeting at. An energy system meets as well the needs of all the parts of the society. That might be very difficult because one person might have different needs than another. But at a certain point in this position, we have to take care of all the people in that, also get familiar to this decision. In this partnership, they have defined different transition initiatives. And I'm very happy. Can you still see the slides? That they use the word transitions, And they build it on systems, but also on the different enabling technologies, regional energy systems, industrial energy systems in a built environment. I'm so sorry. They have, I think the PowerPoint is not so functional. But what these partnerships do, and I just say, please go to their website and they can read it all by themselves. They are organizing calls. They just have an info day, and they're launching, and I think it's addressing all the aspects which are needed for this transition. And that's something very good to keep in mind. They record all their own sessions and will guide you through the process. My objective, in fact, of this presentation is that you really think, don't do all the things alone, but work together on this. Share your views, have discussions. And I had the presentation with Yasmin, and I really wanted to go right into discussion. And I think we should do that more, to inspire each other to build up the energy security which we need. Thank you. I'm very sorry that the presentation was not working well.
Thanks, Yamina, and thanks, Matthias. So I'm going to welcome you back now for a very quick Q&A. I know Yamina is under a little bit of time pressure, so I'll start with you, Yamina, if that's all right. We're just thinking back to this morning's presentations. We had a number of presentations on, say, vulnerable consumer groups and energy security. And just in terms of promoting and implementing policies around energy sufficiency in the most positive way to ensure that these vulnerable consumer groups don't feel like cuts are being imposed on them or they're, foregoing the essentials. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So if you implement sufficiency policies, then this is the way for you to protect vulnerable consumers. The first thing is that we have to change the structure of energy prices, electricity and gas prices in all our countries. The only countries where electricity prices are done in the other way, so they protect the vulnerable ones are, if I remember well, are Italy and Greece for electricity. But for gas prices, we always have that the less you consume, the higher is the price of the unit of consumed. So this is the first thing that we could do, that we would do through sufficiency measures. The second thing that we would do is that in all our countries, we had a huge increase of the floor area per capita in the last 30 years. This has not been really a choice. As a citizen, if you would like to move to another flat or to buy another flat, then usually it's very difficult to have flats or houses that correspond to your needs in terms of the floor area. And you end up locked in a huge flat. This is the situation of all our parents or grandparents, it depends of our ages, that they are locked in huge flats that are the heating system heats everything, and then their energy bill are very high. So this is a consequence of policies, actually. So these are the things that we could do from policy perspective. There is work to be done on how to reorganize buildings, the existing buildings, and to adapt them to our aging population and the challenges of the 21st century. And one of the challenges, another societal challenge of the 21st century, is that we ended up, most of us, our parents, it's the case of my mother, for example, she is alone in a huge flat. She's in another city, but actually she does not have a social network. It's very difficult to build social network in this case. So there is in one of sufficiency measures, so it has been, for example, implemented in Zurich city, is to have more shared spaces and to find a way that people move to homes that correspond to their needs. And in this case, you remove the causes of the vulnerability of these people. And of course, there is also the income issue, because when you look at sufficiency, you need to look at as well labor policies and the income policies, which goes beyond energy, far beyond energy. So there are plenty of measures that are sufficiency measures that are there that would protect the most vulnerable ones if we would have sufficiency policies. Unfortunately, we do not have sufficiency policies, for example, in any of the Commission of the EU instrument. It does not exist.
Thank you very much. That was very comprehensive, and I can see there's some Q&A coming in actually. So what we'll do is we'll be able to compile them and we can share them with you after as well. Matthias, if I just move on to you in terms of, we're speaking kind of then about end users and how in research funding and research calls that we have, how we can kind of incorporate these end users to ensure that they're seen and that their needs and requirements as we move through this entire journey are felt.
It's not an easy one. We are all normal citizens, and I think everybody should speak up, thinking about himself as well into the project. You're not only a researcher or an owner of a company or in the company. You also have still your family, friends, etc. around, and listen to them in that respect, I would say. We are organizing as well. We have EU surveys that we are asking as well people to speak up. And when we are developing a new policy, but also program, we try to do kind of pre-publication and to get their inputs. But it is listening. To be honest, also media are playing a role. Regularly, I'm inspired as well what I'm seeing on TV. And when the journalists are talking with people in the street, I think, okay, maybe there is something. We should work on that. It is not easy, but we really have to think about the integration on adapting the technology. Because what Jasmina was already saying, if you don't have any biking lanes in the city, people will not bike. And that's maybe as well, if you don't give the tools for people to use the new technologies or to integrate, then they will not use it. And we have seen that. The technology might be perfect, but we still need to use it. But I don't have a straight answer exactly how to do it, but we're trying to push the people to do that.
No, thanks. That's great. That's brilliant. I just have one final question for you both. Obviously, this conference is all about connecting research with policy. And we've been working a lot on transdisciplinary research. I wonder where you see the future of research in terms of achieving energy security and what we need to do right now to ensure that we're going the right direction.
What you're doing now already in the conference, I think that's already very good. And I hope that there are a lot of people. What we have to do, I think, bring people together with a different background. I still see too frequently that people from one silo continue in their work and not fully aware of all the conditions which they have to meet, but also not sufficiently talking with grid operators, with other technologies. In Brussels, it's slightly happening, but I think that's very important. And we are not sufficiently talking about the full energy systems as such. And that's, I think, what should be done. So, yeah. But how it will look exactly in 2030, 40, I don't know. You see as well, it's a market, it's very fluid. And when you have the insights, which we have now, 20 years ago, maybe we would have taken other decisions at that time. So it's always difficult.
That's great. Thanks. And over to you, Yamina. Yeah. What are your thoughts for the future and how we can achieve this?
I think we must make interdisciplinary research happening, because we have been talking about it for the last 20 or maybe 30 years, but it's not really happening. We are still staying in our silos. I have been working on a project about a new modeling framework. And for this, you need to bring people from different disciplines. And what we realized is that each of us is there, knows only about his or her discipline and the methods of his or her discipline. And then it's basically trying to convince the other ones to come to their discipline. But this is not, we don't know the interdisciplinary methods. I don't know about them. I don't know if you know about them. I'm happy to take them. And this is something that I do consider this is something we must invent, actually. And then we also need to, the link between science and policies is not as strong as we think it is. So we hear very often the Commission saying that they would like to do science-based policies, etc. But actually, this interface is not as strong as you have people doing research only pure research and you have people doing policies and you have only few people making this link. And we need more people making this link, because if we do not make this link, then scientific policy people do not read scientific publications. And this is just fact. And they are not going to go to Nature Climate Change to read Nature Climate Change, what is there. But what they have time to read at the best is one page or summary page or something like that. And this is something that we don't do as scientists usually. So there is an effort to make from both sides, and we really must invent the interdisciplinary approach to science and to policymaking.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I wish we could go on for longer. I'm actually this is a brilliant conversation, and we'll be racking your brains again in future, no doubt. So thank you both for joining me today.
Yeah.
Claire,
yes.
What Yamina was saying at the end is right. The translation research to policy is not sufficiently working. And it's also what I'm saying in international platforms is, do we have a policy page, a one-pager? What are the lessons which we have to bring to the policymakers for the decision maker? Just one beautiful report. Even the IPCC report's far too long, in my view. I'm not going to read it. But if it could be in a 2-page summary, it would be great.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much, both.
Bye.
We now have a final presentation from Paul Bonnet-Blanc. So Paul is a project manager in energy efficiency at the French Ministry of Energy. Paul's presentation today will focus on the French National Sufficiency Roadmap, a long-term commitment. So it's very well suited to the conversation we've just had.
Good day, everyone. I'm Paul Bonnet-Blanc from the Ministry of Energy in France. I'm project manager for energy efficiency and energy sufficiency. We'll be talking about our roadmap regarding energy sufficiency. To start with, we'll be using a definition, and I selected sufficiency, energy sufficiency definition of the IPCC just to start. And basically, the importance regarding these definitions that concern commodities from energy, materials, land, and water is the two faces of the coin. On the one side, the delivering human well-being still, and within planetary boundaries. And that's led us to, that was a guide when we were talking about energy efficiency and the balance between well-being and also just saving energy. It started with the first roadmap led by an initiative by the French government in June 2022. The plan was issued on the 6th of October, so it took about three months, 2022, in the summer. Our minister, Agnès Pannier-Runacher, defined a target of minus 10% of energy consumption by 2024 compared to 2019. The idea was to get rid of COVID-related years of 2020 and 2021. And the energy consumption was not really relevant to set a proper target. So that's why we took as a reference 2015. At the same time, minus 10% is related to gas and electricity. At the very beginning, fuel related mainly to transportation was not considered. It was more also related, when you think about it, due to the energy crisis and because of the war in Ukraine. So it was very important for the first step to address the issue of energy security during the winter 2022-2023. But now we are working more on the long-term commitment. That's also enhanced by the step 2 issued June 20th this year of the energy sufficiency roadmap. which focus on energy saving tips for the summer. That was one of the issue addressed by the communication campaign launched just before the summer, and also thinking about the long-term commitment. All these initiatives and, let's say, binding into an energy sufficiency roadmap is a bottom-up approach. So there were 9 to 10 working groups which designed some relevant actions in each sector. Housing, office building, transportation, sport, and also government entities. That was also a specificity of the roadmap. The government should lead the way. So there was really important actions and set higher standard in terms of reducing room temperature. And also initiatives for energy saving in government buildings. There were 15 priority actions at the time when it was issued in October 2022. And there were also a lot of communication around it, like a checklist of energy saving tips for each sector, from households, companies, building owners, and transportation again, and sport. Of course, to disseminate and to enhance the energy sufficiency actions, there was a nationwide energy saving campaign through the TV, radio, internet, and the press. It insisted on the 5 energy saving tips, from setting temperature not above 19 degrees in building, set water heater to 55 degrees and not above, and 3 others energy saving tips. That was the winter version of our campaign. There was later from June, was launched in mid-June, actually, the 20th, when the step 2 was announced. A summer version insisting also about room temperature, not below 26 degrees when you will be using air conditioning. And also talking about insisting on transportation issues and talking about using your bike or even walking for small distances, and also car sharing whenever it's possible. So basically, the first period when we monitor energy consumption accurately, it has been reported that for both gas and electricity, the reduction, and I insist on that, climate adjusted, was minus 12.2%, down, from the period of 2022-2023, from 2018 to 19. The reporting period was set to the 1st of August to the 21st of July. It concerned both electricity and natural gas. You have figures here, so it's with some of a discrepancy between electricity and natural gas, minus 8.1% regarding the gas and minus 17%, but overall was minus 12.2% total. And again, climate adjusted. We monitor electricity and natural gas, and that's why more related to buildings. And transportation is part of the discussion for the next step and more for the long-term commitment. On the right-hand side, top, you see one of the main calculation we made at the time of the summer 2022, we anticipated from this group of actions about 50 terawatt hour per year energy saving through sufficiency. And the main one was, of course, setting temperature not above 19 degrees. And that makes, when you consider the world consumption, depending the year, from around 1,000 terawatt hour per year total consumption electricity and gas, compared to the anticipated energy saving of 50 terawatt hour for these actions. That was 5%. So let's say that results of minus 12.2% was really a success. On the longer term, we have scenarios that was studied by the electricity network operator, RTE, and that report is a 2021. So now we are working on the basis of some of the scenarios. I display this one, but there are some others from ADEME, also the French Energy Management and Environment, where we consider more long-term commitment as far as energy sufficiency is concerned. So I put on the slides 2 excerpts on this one for housing and offices. And now we are discussing some of key elements more on a long-term basis, which is how far can we go for space sharing, hot water consumption reduction, for offices teleworking, and when we move to transportation, car sharing, discussion around the average cruising speed of course, to reduce also energy consumption, and to work also on the size of the average passenger car. So everything is in the bundle of energy sufficiency. Of course, we are working on energy efficiency as a whole, but we have specific targets now for sufficiency, as we anticipate that energy efficiency will not be enough to reach greenhouse gas emission reduction or net zero in 2050, and will not be enough also to reduce to have energy security for the mid to the longer term. So basically, that's now the long-term commitment. And to finish with, one of the actions from municipalities was to reduce public street light, reduce or switch off at night. That picture was taken by just a simple mobile phone on the eve of December 25th. And you could see now in France, you can see the sky. We're rediscovering the sky again. And that's also co-benefits, along with some of the co-benefits we are advocating, like using your bike or walking is for small distance journey is a lot better than taking your car. So thank you very much. I'm available by email or any other means, and I will be happy to discuss any matter related to this, to the French energy sufficiency roadmap. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm delighted that we've been able to go through all these presentations today. We've had some brilliant speakers, and I'm going to take this moment to thank our speakers. So we had Dr. Matthias Souda, Dr. Yamina Saheb, and Dr. Paul Bonnet-Blanc, who all contributed to the presentation session. Now I have the pleasure of welcoming a fellow SEI colleague who will chair the next closing panel discussion. We have Jim Shear, who is the Head of Data and Insights here at SEI.
Thanks very much, Claire. It's great to be here. I've been really enjoying the conference so far. I'm joined by a very learned panel of speakers for this last panel session of the day. We're going to be discussing current and future perspectives on energy security. And just so we can get straight to the chat, the speakers have agreed that I'll read their introductions and we'll launch straight into the conversation then. So I'm joined by Professor Claire Dupont, Associate Research Professor, European Governance and Sustainability Transformations at Ghent University in Belgium, Professor Barry McMullen, who's Professor of Engineering and Computing at DCU, Dr. Muireann Lynch, Senior Researcher at the ESRI here in Ireland, Dr. Jan Rosenau, Principal and Director of European Programs at the Regulatory Assistance Programme. You're all very welcome and really appreciate your time. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to start with you, Claire. We heard a little bit from you this morning, and in your video you showed the much referenced energy trilemma. And I think it's a good place to start our conversation with the objectives of security, sustainability and equity. What observations can you share based on your experience in Europe around that framework of the trilemma? And are there any priorities in the various corners of it, or what do you see from your position?
Oh, first, thanks a lot, Jim, and thanks to the SEI for inviting me to this conference. I was listening in a little bit this afternoon, and really interesting and inspiring discussions. You don't start with an easy question, Jim, but from a European context, what we've seen in Europe is an evolution, I think, at the European level at least, in the way we look at this energy trilemma, because this energy trilemma that we talk about is about three goals for our energy policy that are supposed to be coherent, but in fact are very difficult to implement together. So we see energy security predominantly defined as security of supply. We see energy equity as about affordability and price. And then we look at environmental sustainability as another corner of this trilemma, which is about the energy system not causing harm to the environment or climate. And having those three goals together has been really difficult in practice. And the political changes in priorities have been quite dramatic over the course of history. We're in a kind of a special moment now, I think, in the European context, where when we heard also from the Commission speaker earlier, that where the European Commission really has very little competence to make broad energy security decisions for its member states, but it does have competence on energy consumption issues, or energy efficiency is how they describe it in the treaties, and renewable energies. So there, for many years, the European Commission has been advancing these particular pillars as the way to achieve all three goals coherently. And I think it's very interesting at this moment, because since the energy crisis and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there has been a kind of a shift in understanding also of the supply security side of things, where politically that was just about making sure we have enough supply of energy, and it didn't matter that that came from Russia. But there's now a political decision that we no longer want to have supplies of fossil fuels from Russia, which means that energy security is now a political conversation about not only supply, security of supply, getting the energy, but also where that energy comes from, what type of energy it is, how do we diversify away from Russia as opposed to diversifying away from fossil fuels, and then the coherence that you can have between diversifying away from Russia, but also increasing our share of renewables and reducing our energy consumption.
Thanks for that answer. And I think you did a great job of highlighting the tension between the three. And I got a sense that political priorities maybe shift between the three at various times. And maybe many on the call might be big up for security, but others might, their major focus might be on the sustainability side of things. So you talked about, used a term in your presentation, regenerative approaches, and you felt that that's where Europe was shifting. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that term?
So I think Europe is shifting there by accident, because I'm not sure that the European policymakers necessarily understand fully the implications of the European Green Deal that they have agreed, and the system approach also that has been spoken about a lot this afternoon. So a regenerative approach is really taking the sustainability aspect as the core objective of the trilemma and trying to figure out how to make sure that our whole, let's call them human, social, ecosystems, human social nature ecosystems, or various systems are seen together, and that our policy responses need to get us to a place where we improve the quality and carrying and adaptive capacity of our natural systems for our own social benefit. And this is something that you can see playing out quite well in a city context. So you can do a very good experiment in your mind about how you manage water and energy and green spaces in a city and transport and all these different interconnecting systems to make sure, for example, that you have a city that becomes more resilient to increasing temperatures and heat waves, that it becomes better at managing resources, whether that's energy, and sharing resources, whether that's energy, water, etc. So this regenerative approach is more about the sustainability transitions objective and less specifically about security. But then the idea is that these are of course, interconnected. And I think, there's an understanding that sustainability is far more now than just reducing consumption of fossil fuels. There's more to it because we've gone a bit beyond the tipping points and the impacts that we should have gone beyond.
But Barry, I think I'd like to flow to you now. You've considered the trilemma and various weightings as well, and Claire talks about here by circumstance or by design. Should we be considering the three pillars of the trilemma as equal, or some other model more appropriate in your view?
Okay, well, thanks, Jim. And yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed Claire's presentation this morning, and particularly the version of these three things mapped onto the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So yeah, look, there are these three distinguishable dimensions. They are clearly all important. We want them all. They clearly interact in complex ways. In different contexts and in different circumstances, we will want to focus more attention on one rather than another. So today, the SEAI annual conference is choosing to focus on energy security, and that's fine. There's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. But I do just make a point that there is a conceptual issue with the trilemma framing, or as it's sometimes, people talk about three pillars or a three-legged stool. And I don't like that, because I think it triggers the wrong sort of mental model of the relationship between these three. So I say, there are three, they interact, they're all important, okay? But conceptually, they're not three legs of one stool. They're a pyramid of what I call an energy needs hierarchy. We need all three of these things. But at the end of the day, the bottom of that hierarchy, the thing that everything else rests on, is ultimately sustainability. And sustainability, as Claire has indicated there, is no longer just about the climate aspect of energy, but the wider, we're facing, as well, the news this morning, in case nobody has caught up with it yet, the latest iteration on the planetary boundaries work indicates that we're transgressing, I now think it's 6 of the global critical planetary boundaries at this stage. Global humanity is in overshoot of planetary boundaries. We're not going to be in overshoot. We are in overshoot. We're already in this complex set of sustainability emergencies. So that sustainability aspect of energy is determinant. We have to have that. It wouldn't matter how secure or how cheap our energy was if it wasn't sustainable. But within the set of potential sustainable solutions, of course, then we want security, we want predictability, we want confidence. I mean, psychologically and for the operation of complex societies, we need confidence about the availability of energy over years into the future. So we need that security. Doesn't necessarily mean independence. The different countries and regions will have different strengths and weaknesses. So that there are important roles for trading of energy resources continuing into the future. But it'll be a different kind of trade, and a bit more attention to buffering, having strategic stores of energy will come into play. But then within that, of course, we want the cheapest way. But costs are extremely variable. So yes, we should try to structure our markets and our systems to minimize costs for everybody, but we do need to make sure that sustainability and security are protected in the pursuit of lowest cost, rather than saying, oh, give us the cheapest thing and not worry about the other two things at all. That's my perspective.
I think that's very clear, Barry, and we get that hierarchical view with sustainability as the foundation. In your work at the ESRI, Muireann Lynch, you've also considered the trilemma. Given recent developments internationally, which have probably driven the political focus towards security and affordability, and in a lot of the conversations, and I guess the very strong targets, carbon budgets, and sectoral ceilings here in Ireland, how do you currently frame security in the work that you do, and do you agree with the hierarchical approach, and does that apply all the time or just sometimes? What do you think?
Well, I couldn't agree more with the last thing Barry said, which was to say, oh, give us the cheapest thing and we don't care about the others. That is absolute nonsense. And anybody who says, give us the cheapest thing and we don't care about sustainability or security is just not at the races at all. And I don't need to spend any time on that point. We're all very agreed on that, thankfully. I understand. I like the idea of changing the framework away from a trilemma and toward a hierarchy. But I suppose what I would say is it's very important to distinguish between the short term and the long term. So it's certainly true that in the long term, we need everything to be sustainable, because if we end up just destroying all life on the planet, then that is literally not sustainable. So I don't necessarily have a problem with the kind of hierarchical approach in the long term. My problem is that in the short term, it is very much a trilemma, because there are people who have, for example, certain medical conditions, who need to use certain medical equipment. And if they do not have access to secure, affordable energy, they will die next week. So it is completely useless to say, oh, but we need to be sustainable because otherwise in 50 years' time, we're all dead, if you personally are going to be dead next week. And we can extend that in that we could stop using all fossil fuels tomorrow. That is an option available to us. And within 2 months, vast numbers of people will be dead. So let's just, in the short term, we have to kind of focus the minds a little bit on the fact that it is very much a trilemma. There's also the fact that politics is the art of the possible. And one of the things I've been saying a lot, Jim, is I've been working in sustainability and renewable energy integration in particular since I started my PhD in 2010. And absolutely nobody wanted to talk to me until 2 years ago, when electricity prices and energy prices went really, really high. And now suddenly I'm being invited onto the radio every 2 weeks. And I always try to plug the sustainability angle while I'm there. But the reality is, if our options are not affordable, at least in the short term, then they will not get off the blocks in the policy space. Now, that's not to say that we should just throw up our hands and say, okay, we can only focus on the cheap stuff at all. What we need to do is we need to continue to work in the policy space in order to ensure that we're keeping the trilemma in view in the long run, but also making sure that whatever we do is politically possible. So that would be my take on kind of the trilemma versus the hierarchy. I think it's also very important when we're talking about security to distinguish between physical and price security. So physical security is, do we have the actual molecules of oil or gas or coal or the actual units of electricity to meet our needs? And then price security is, okay, we may have actual access to the physical energy, but at a price that most people can't afford, which is still not much use. So both are very important. And from an economic point of view, certainty in price is valuable. So that means that a higher but certain price is more valuable to society than a lower but very variable price. So something that has a lower price on average but has a lot of variation around it. So that's one way where we can kind of maybe trade off to a lesser extent, in that renewable electricity, for example, may have a higher price in average. Now that's changing, but it may have a higher price on average. But the fact that the price is certain and is fixed is very valuable to the consumer. And the fact that we have changed the design of our renewable energy options, for example, to have a fixed price rather than a floor price, is also valuable to the consumer, and it's valuable to society as well.
Thanks, Miriam. I think you make a couple of really great distinctions there, and I think you're talking about almost leveraging whatever situation is occurring politically to bring in other aspects of the trilemma, even if or getting that sustainability on the agenda, even if it's not the primary focus in the particular moment, and also this distinction between price and physical security. You were quoted recently as saying the idea that we can tackle the climate crisis by limiting the indigenous production of fossil fuels is nonsense. To really tackle the climate crisis, we must limit our demand for fossil fuels, not our supply, and that energy security must focus on supply. Could you say a little bit about what you mean about that distinction between energy security being a supply side focus but not a demand side?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a little bit concerned at the extent to which our climate action in this country seems to focus so much on limiting exploration for fossil fuels. Now, that's not to say that I think we should do loads and loads of exploration for fossil fuels. That's not my point. But what I'm saying is the thing that drives emissions is Irish demand for and usage of fossil fuels. The climate doesn't care a toss if a unit of gas came out of Corrib or came from Qatar. Either way, it's a ton of carbon being released into the atmosphere, which causes global warming. So in order to meet our sustainability goals, what we must focus on is the demand for fossil fuels and the demand for carbon goods. And we have to get that demand right down. In the meantime, in order to ensure secure supply, a diverse supply is far more secure than a supply that comes from a shrinking number of sources. And we've seen that really clearly throughout the energy crisis and the fact that Russia was able to weaponize energy. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that we should forget about it and we should just go digging for oil and gas or anything like that. What I'm saying is when it comes to where the policy focus should be, climate is about getting the demand down, security is about getting the supply as diverse as possible, which includes diversifying into new sources such as renewable synthetic biofuels, but it also includes diversifying where we get our fossil fuels from in the meantime, with the long run goal obviously being to stop all usage of fossil fuels.
Thanks, Miriam. I think that's clear. And I'll go to Jan Rose now, who is a well-renowned champion for all things renewables and energy efficiency. In a recent LinkedIn post, Jan, you said gas demand reduction is critical for energy security, and that new analysis shows that to ensure energy security next winter, Europe needs to reduce gas demand by up to 26% if we face a cold winter. Do you agree with Miriam's views on demand side energy efficiency in the context of security here, or is energy security really best focused on the supply side?
You know what the answer is that I will give you, Jim, as someone who has worked on energy demand for almost 2 decades. I think it is at least as important as the discussion about supply. And from where I sit, most of the discussion about energy has really circulated around the supply side. A lot of it is about electricity, and it has been about coal, nuclear, renewables. And that's all very well because we've made some good progress with electricity. We have driven down emissions in most countries in Europe, in some more than in others. But that's been good news. But we have neglected and continue to neglect the other parts of the energy sector, which make up the bulk of energy use. Electricity is only roughly about a fifth of our final energy use. The other bits is mainly heating and transport, industry and buildings for heat, and then transport in the different segments, road, air, and water, and that's been neglected. And one of the issues I'm deeply worried about is that, yes, we had this crisis, and we have made lots of attempts to diversify our supply away from pipeline Russian gas. That's quite important, I think, to say, because when you look at the detail, you will find that some of the LNG that's coming to Europe has Russian origins. It's just been processed elsewhere and then repurposed and is being imported, but it's still the origin is still from Russia. But the neglected piece, I think, in this is the demand side. Yes, there's been demand reduction last winter, and that has been celebrated to some extent. Let's not forget, and this goes back to the points that the previous speakers made, some of that demand reduction wasn't something that people voluntarily did because they wanted to save a little bit of money. This caused real hardship for people who were freezing in their homes because they couldn't afford to keep warm. this is not sustainable. This is not a pathway we want to go down in the future again. Even some demand reduction, that was not driven by hardship, but by people really wanting to reduce gas demand. But there are real adverse effects of this. Final point, perhaps on the demand question, is more about the structural changes. That's the hard bit. Changing energy efficiency of our buildings, making them more efficient, is a good example. That takes decades, and I have just not seeing enough effort in the political space to tackle those kinds of questions. Or look at industrial energy use. Vast potential to stop combusting fossil fuels, replacing that with renewables, renewable electricity. We're not doing enough there either. So those really difficult, complex structural changes, that's where we ought to focus, in my view, going forward. And I'm not seeing enough effort. Still 90% of the oxygen is being sucked up by the supply side discussion.
Got it, Jan. And look, in terms of context, the Energy Efficiency Directive at European level is requiring member states to put a future cap on energy demand. And these, I think, are proving very challenging for member states. That includes demand from fossil-based sources and renewables. It's a final energy cap. Do you think that's Europe sending a signal to member states that, look, in order to be secure, we also need to use less energy? It doesn't matter if it's renewable or fossil, or what do you think is behind that initiative?
No, I think at the highest level, the European Commission and other European institutions have understood the importance of energy demand reduction, whether that is through efficiency or sufficiency, to come back to a previous theme that was discussed during this conference. But when you then look at the fine detail of implementation, there's an absence still of ambition, I would say. Yes, we have those targets, but another I think point that often gets missed is that those targets are really meaningless if we don't implement the policies to achieve them. Quite often these targets get adopted, whether that's for emissions or for final energy, for primary energy. And politicians love targets because they're easy to announce. They're usually after they are in a position of responsibility. That's when they hit 2030, 2050. But I'm actually not so, targets are useful to give you a bit of guidance, and you can construct policies around them and build scenarios. But the targets in and of themselves don't do anything. It's important to always track very closely, what are we actually doing this year? Are we on track? And if we're not on track, what do we need to do to change that? I know there are actually some countries that do this very, very well, and at least have set up bodies that are independent and will provide that sort of feedback. I'm thinking about the UK's Committee on Climate Change, or in Germany, there's a similar council on climate policy, and they provide independent feedback. Where are we? Where are the gaps on an annual basis? Not looking at the next 20 years, but actually this year, have we done enough? And where will we be in 10, 15, 20 years if we continue on the current trajectory? So I think that is a very, very important area to look at. And the same goes, of course, to come back to your question, Jim, for any of those energy efficiency targets, which we now have in Europe. I'm very worried that we talk too much about these targets and not enough about implementation.
Thanks, Jan. Claire, you're based in Europe and you've been in the corridors around many of these decisions and processes. Do you see the same issue with strong targets from Europe, but perhaps the gap to the policy and, of course, then the necessary action? And if so, what more could Europe do to sort of reach further down into the governance structure and cause deeper policy packages at member state level? Any thoughts around that?
So I completely agree with Jan about the implementation gap. We talk about this a lot in European studies. It's very easy to agree on a long-term target. Even, the 2050 climate neutrality, now it is set in law at the European level, but there's still really no accountability mechanisms for are you on track to that or not? As well as the national level advisory boards and scientific advisory boards. I know there's also a climate change council or advisory council in Ireland, and there's soon going to be one in Belgium. There's also the European Environment Agency that has been doing this "Are we on track?" work for a long time. And what's interesting is if you look at the history of the data that they've been analyzing, you see that for example, in 2020, Europe and the European member states did achieve the goals that they set themselves. But it's hard to know, is this because of policy or because of economic crisis? Because you see in the graphs over time, this fantastic drop in energy consumption, which reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and which also had a way of promoting a bit more renewable energies, also from 2006, 2009, and 2014, which were other Russian gas crises with Europe as well. So these crises have been moments where things have evolved. It's hard to tell if that's really because of policies. So we managed to achieve our targets to 2020. Is the conclusion there that we should enter an economic recession? Well, I guess that's not what we're trying to say, but it does say something about the need for a more, and you talked about it a lot in the conference today, integrated, joined up thinking, planning approach to get to the sorts of goals we're talking about. And I think what Muireann was saying about the long-term, short-term is crucial, because we can set a long-term goal, but we need to have a pathway that includes short-term decision-makings, and I think also across levels of governance, which are not always aligned, to get there. And that's where we're still, I feel, lacking this short-term, really concise planning at multiple levels of governance.
I think then let's maybe explore a little bit how well these European targets may or may not have flown down to the Irish situation. Barry, you've been involved in the carbon budgeting and sectoral ceiling process. You've been watching it very closely. Do you think it adopts and takes on the ambition set by Europe? And do we have a clear pathway to policy action and on the ground activity?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I mean, I think the Irish experiment, we can call it that, I think, is a very interesting one. The jury is definitely out as to what the lessons will ultimately be. But I think it is a very interesting experiment. Jan and Claire both make the point that far away distant targets are politically convenient, but in terms of implementation, very ineffective. And again, Muireann made the point that politics at some level is the art of the possible, but we've had 40 years of politics failing to respond effectively to the climate challenge. So the art of the possible to date has essentially decided that it's impossible. So we need something different. And as I say, we have this Irish experiment. And again, it speaks to Muireann's point. I think we're sort of violently in agreement that at the end of the day, the only way emissions go down is by the consumption of fossil fuels going down, and emissions from energy is by the consumption of fossil fuels going down. But the Irish experiment with our carbon budget system, 5-year program of rolling 5-year carbon budgets, is essentially an experiment in bringing forward the long-term plans into the present. So you're forced to bring it into the present, or at least that's the theory. As I say, we have to wait and see how it works out in practice. So we have, under the current Irish legislation, a long-term goal, which is climate neutrality by 2050. But that's in a sense trumped by the short-term compliance with 5-year emissions targets, which are adopted by the Oireachtas, but on the basis of advice from the Independent Climate Change Advisory Council. And they in turn are constrained to advise on the basis of the global contribution to the Paris Agreement commitments. So what the Council recommended and what were adopted were very stringent carbon budgets, because that's the situation we're now in. And moreover, so that brings you into a 5-year perspective rather than a 10 or 15 or 20-year perspective immediately. And moreover, the legislation was very clear and explicit that any overrun in a budget period flows into as an immediate deficit, as an immediate charge against the following period. So, you don't kick the can down the road, really, or at least, as I say, this is the theory of the system. But we're now 2.5 years plus into the first budget period. Everybody ostensibly understands that we are dramatically overshooting even the first budget. And the second budget, which was already much more challenging than the first budget, is now much more challenging again if there is that feed forward. And yet, if you're listening to the political discussion or the political sphere, or you're watching the media discussion, it's as if there's almost no mention of it. Now, we'll see as we go into the autumn and a new climate action plan has to be brought forward. There's a new case challenging the government's lack of delivery on the budget system. We'll be going into elections next year. So the Irish experiment is going to get very hot and heavy over the next 12 months to see whether, as I say, we can bring targets into the here and now, distant targets into the here and now. But in reality, and again, anybody who's tuned in knows this very well, in reality, to meet those carbon budgets now, they're now immediate. We would have to find ways to significantly reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And the painless ways are long-term, if there are any painless ways. So short-term ways of reducing emissions are painful and potentially, and again, Muireann makes this point very rightly and forcefully, potentially very unfair and unjust. Mm-hmm. So we now have to find ways of constraining fossil fuel consumption. And as I say, it takes time to expand energy supply. So when it becomes a short-term problem, it's a problem of consumption, because that's what we can do in the short term. So constraining it in the short term and yet doing that at the same time as, ensuring that people don't die of cold in their homes, or, critical supplies of electricity to medical devices don't fail, or these kinds of things. This is very difficult to navigate. And I say it's going to be fascinating to see, does Ireland show that it's possible to force this conversation into a society-wide consciousness or not? And I'm very excited to see, does it work?
Thanks, Barry. And I think really giving us a sense that the current target structure has both an immediate term implication, given the cumulative nature of emissions in the atmosphere, and longer term signals as well, and obviously ultimate goals like net zero. You ended up talking about possibility there, Muireann, in terms of delivery and possibility. What do you see from where you're sitting? You referred to politics being the art of the possible.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts on this. I think the carbon budgets are a super interesting experiment, but sometimes I think that even what they mean has not kind of resonated properly with people. So if we think of it in terms of a financial budget, it would be almost as if we said, hey, the government expenditure in 2025 is going to be zero. And that's because we spent all the money in 2021, 22, 23, and 24. So in 2025, there will be no schools, no hospitals, no Gardaí, no social welfare payments, nothing. And because we spent it all in the previous 4 years. That is what carbon budgets are supposed to look like. And I don't think that has sunk in at all. Now, would we make any headway if we started framing it in that way? I'm not sure. I was really surprised when the EPA released their figures a couple of months ago, showing that we had no hope of meeting the 2025 carbon budget, and not really any hope of meeting the 2031 either. I was surprised, A, at how much discussion it actually generated in the media, and B, I was surprised at how surprised everybody was. And I realized I'm in a bit of a bubble. I mean, myself and my colleagues, we've all known, as Barry was saying, for ages that we haven't a hope of doing this. Why is it so surprising? And I wonder if part of the issue might be people are still very unsure about the basics of where our energy and our emissions are coming from. And I just want to add that this is not limited to the energy space. I mean, if you ask most people, where does the majority of social welfare expenditure go? The vast majority of people say unemployment benefit. It's not true. It's pensions. Most people haven't a clue where our financial expenditure goes. So it's not really surprising that people haven't a clue where our emissions are coming from either. So most people are very surprised, for example, to hear that electricity is only about 20% of our energy usage. Most people are very surprised to hear that the majority of the emissions for the transport sector come from private car usage. usage, just people dropping their kids to and from GAA, people popping up and down to the shops. People tend to think of ginormous factories, or people tend to think of private enterprise or trucks or whatever. And I think that might be part of the issue. We don't actually understand how much of a role we personally play. And we also don't understand how little heavy lifting can be done by the likes of wind turbines and solar panels. We could get our emissions from the electricity sector to zero tomorrow, and we'd still have 80% plus of our energy emissions to deal with, because most of our emissions don't come from the electricity sector. Mm-hmm. Having said that, as a possible solution, I've been kicking around the idea for a while now that even though our renewable targets for electricity were way more stringent than our renewable targets for heat or transport, we've actually done far better in terms of meeting them. So could that be because the consumer didn't have to do very much? They continued to use electricity as normal, and we changed the fuel. Whereas in order to get our renewable heat and transport targets, we are actually expecting consumers to do an awful lot. We're expecting them to change how they travel. We're expecting them to change what they travel in. We're expecting them to do some maybe significant work retrofitting their home. And I'm wondering if maybe we're expecting the consumer to do a bit too much. And is it time for a plan B, where the consumer does a little bit less? Yes, it costs more, but at least we get it done. Now, what does the plan B look like? I don't know. I'm not sure how quickly we can get biofuels, for example, on stream. I'm not sure if we can do it any quicker than the heat pumps and the EVs. But I do think that this needs to start to become part of the conversation, because as we have seen, implementation is a massive challenge. We're addicted to targets in Ireland, and yet so far we haven't met them, and we're really far away from meeting these carbon budgets.
Striking comments. Jan, the politics of implementation?
I think this was a really interesting avenue to go into, actually, because we kind of started with the targets, and we said implementation is important, but the challenge of implementation has become so apparent, I think, especially over the last few months. Yeah, we've had fierce debates in so many different places around the world about the actual implementation of, sometimes quite ambitious policies. You may think about the phase out of internal combustion engine cars at European level. Huge debates in Brussels about that. Lots of resistance. The same goes for the German heating law, which you may have followed. The German government wanted to introduce a law, and now has introduced a law, but much watered down, to prevent the installation of new fossil fuel heating systems in the future. Huge uproar. But I would maybe add to what has been said before. I mean, this is hard, and it requires people, households, consumers, whatever we want to call them, businesses, to play their part and be engaged. It's not just something that happens upstream. You don't see it. It will have an impact on your personal life in some way. But there's also at the same time a coordinated campaign going on that's been exposed, funded by special interest groups, to stop any meaningful progress, to slow it down, to delay it. And what we see in terms of the media discussion, it's really, I think, confused in that some of these messages, they have validity to them. Like people really need support, they need guidance, they need help. But there's also misinformation, and it's targeted misinformation to confuse people, so that nothing happens and nothing ever changes. So it's the role of policymakers, of politicians, in my view, to cut through the noise and provide clear guidance and support, and make this as easy as possible for people to come along and to crowd out some of the noises that we keep hearing, basically just try to delay, and distinguishing between real concerns that are justifiable and just special interest groups trying to stop any meaningful progress is going to be really important, I think, going forward. But it's going to be hard. This is not easy. It's much easier to build wind farms, maybe offshore even, which no one sees, or have some solar panels on rooftops, than changing cars, heating systems, retrofitting buildings. It's much more difficult.
Thanks, Jan. I'm going to come to you, Claire, now, because I think there's a segue here to a nice topic, and it's been brought up by some of the people listening in the comments. The governing structures that we've set up today globally, right up to the COP process, haven't worked as well as they might have, and there's a lot of critique around those. Does that failure impact the trilemma? And the speaker's asking here where such governing structures give more weight to security and ignore maybe equity or other considerations that we really need to bring the people along, and obviously some of the outcomes of what we're trying to do is contributing to policymakers and those kind of things is to, solve multiple objectives of government at the same time. What are your thoughts there around those issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think I want to hop a little bit off what Jan was just saying about, the responsibility of policymakers to cut through some of the noise and misinformation. And I think what's particularly difficult, maybe it's not so much in Ireland, but certainly in other EU countries, that some of the policymakers and some of the politicians are part of that misinformation process. And so it's very difficult as a citizen, if you're not informed about these issues, to know whether or not your information is reliable. So it's quite challenging, and I think I don't really have a solution to it, but I think we can't rely only on policymakers to do that work. And I feel that the scientific community probably has a bigger role to play there too. So maybe that's also a call to action to myself. But I think it's important to think about the equity dimension far more, from the very local individual level right up to the global scale. So for example, if we think about what the EU has done, which is where my expertise lies, so I'll keep coming back to it, what the EU has done since the energy crisis is that it has introduced a whole program and set of policies to increase its renewable energy share, to really roll out solar rooftop very quickly, to reduce energy consumption with the sorts of hardships that we've heard about for various reasons, and at the same time to diversify its supply of fossil fuels. It has done that by soaking up nearly all the supplies of liquefied natural gas on the global market at a high price, willing to pay the high price, which has meant that other countries, Pakistan has faced blackouts, other countries are moving to coal. So in the global context, there is a knock-on effect of whatever we do in Europe and in our own countries that can have knock-on effects that are unjust in terms of the sustainability transition as well, and that are also unjust in terms of the longer-term development possibilities for other countries who have been for decades now told by us that you have to leapfrog this fossil infrastructure that we've relied on for our economic development so that we don't destroy the climate, but historically we're the ones who are responsible for it. The global level, it's very complex, and our institutions haven't been good at dealing with that. But it's also a local level and a community level issue. And I think we need to think about equity as really about access to energy, whether that's access to the sorts of technologies that allow us to have sustainable energy sources, but access also in terms of affordability. I think sometimes we focus very much on the affordability and a lot less on the access. And there is where we have policies that are needed, and decisions about infrastructure and decisions about support policies to help communities or individuals to actually invest where it's needed, even to give grants or loans at zero interest rates, whatever it is. There are possibilities in the policy-making toolkit if only we were imaginative and brave enough in the political context.
Some great keywords coming out there, brave, being another that I've jotted down. Miriam, can you translate that into some national level observations?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the tricky things about this is there's a kind of a trade-off between salience and equity. In that, in the Irish context, if we were to enact some of the policies that have been enacted in other countries, such as capping energy bills, for example, or kind of directly regulating tariffs, that's great because nobody's bill is skyrocketing the way it has been recently. However, it actually channels the majority of funds toward higher income households, and also potentially to businesses. So what the government has done in the Irish context instead is focused on trying to boost people's incomes in order to enable them to afford these higher energy bills. This is actually a good policy move from an equity point of view, because you're able to use the tax and welfare system to more effectively target the lowest income households. And it also means that you preserve those efficiency incentives that we want to preserve. Unfortunately, it's very difficult politically because it's really hard to explain to somebody, yes, okay, your energy bill is €50 higher than it was last month, but on the other hand, your pension's also gone up, so you're grand. That tends not to fly. That argument tends not to land, even though we can do the maths and we can see this is the way to most effectively target people and indeed to be progressive so that the net income or the net impact on lower income households means that they're better off. I'm not sure how you crack that chestnut, but I suppose the important thing is the importance of seeing energy in the round as part of the social transition, rather than just saying, okay, bills are higher, we have to put them down. Bills are higher, we have to put them down. Bills are higher, we have to put them down. And instead saying, how are we moving forward all together and what's the net impact on your incomes? I think it's important as well to remember that when it comes to security in Ireland, there are some specifics about the Irish system that mean we stand out in a European context. So when you're part of a massive AC interconnected power system, like most countries in Europe are, you can borrow from your neighbor, you can interconnect easily. It's going to be windy somewhere, it's going to be sunny somewhere else, and interconnection can do an awful lot for the security argument. In Ireland, interconnection definitely helps with our security, whether it's our gas interconnectors or our electricity interconnectors. However, we still need to be able to balance our small isolated power system in real time. We had a historic peak last winter of just over 7 gigawatts, and that's for the whole island. So we're small, and that means that the ratio of our generators to our peak demand is large, and it also means that it's more technically challenging to operate this system at higher and higher levels of IBRs, which is inverter-based resources. And inverter-based resources includes kind of power electronics on the demand side, but it also includes the DC interconnectors that we have. We're not going to connect AC to anyone. Let's face it, we're not going to change physics. Any interconnectors that we have are DC, which means it's power electronics, and all of the wind and solar is also power electronics. We're facing these technical challenges that the rest of Europe just isn't facing, and we're facing them sooner because we have such high renewable electricity. So that's not to say that we shouldn't pursue an interconnection and that kind of thing as a way of boosting security and sustainability, but we have to be realistic about the fact that Ireland will require other policies and other market interventions to ensure sustainable electricity supply and secure electricity supply. And that's also important to remember in the context of the goals for electrifying our heat and our transport. So as more and more of our energy needs come from the electricity grid, it's crucial that we maintain that security of the electricity grid, because otherwise we're going to see everything go down if electricity goes down. At the moment, if your lights go out, okay, you can jump in your car and drive over to your mother-in-law's if you have to. But if your car is also relying on that electricity grid, then that option won't be there.
Barry, will you extend the Irish reflections in that light? Thanks, Mira.
I suppose maybe Muireann is absolutely right to highlight the challenges for Ireland in electricity because of our relative geographical isolation. If we want to try to be optimistic for a moment, you can also say that's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity that Ireland has taken. We have demonstrated very high levels of penetration, instantaneous penetration, now over 75% of these IBR type generation into the Irish system. And that's world leading, but and getting higher is going to be challenging. But there's certainly good prospects with the experience we have under our belt to go significantly higher, probably not to 100%. And, that's a separate technical discussion about exactly how far you can push that. But I think Ireland has a role to play there. But as Muireann also said, even if you could completely decarbonize electricity in the morning, that would only represent, at the moment, 20% of our final energy consumption. So we have an awful lot more to do on top of that. I think the conversation, and it's not really for today, but it does tie into this question of Ireland's role. The conversation of getting to that 100% instantaneous and then 100% year round on electricity, but B, to dealing with the expansion of the electricity system, decarbonize the other sectors. In Ireland, the heavy lifting on that, there's just virtually no other way to see that panning out other than a reliance on chemical fuels, chemical fuels produced from electricity. And again, Ireland, because of just our particular point on the curve, needs to be ahead of the curve relative to other countries on that. And that's going to be challenging and difficult and painful, but it's also an opportunity. And the things we learn here and the things we demonstrate here can be very helpful to other countries if we actually go for that. And you know, so far at least we are trying to go for it. But yes, we have all these other problems we're trying to deal with, and equity in the transition is very problematic, and the politics is very problematic. But getting to a point of much more robust, honest conversations at a national level, I think, you know, that's the most desperately needed thing. Jan's point about certain actors benefiting from keeping the discussion as messy and complicated and diffuse as possible is a really important one. And I'm not, both our politicians and our media, I think, need to get a lot more savvy about that and see their proper role as helping wider society cut through that noise and understand better what our genuine predicaments are and the genuine ways forward are, which are not going to be painless, but they're not back to the Stone Age either, which is the sort of thing that gets thrown at me all the time. You know, that actually is a huge amount of space between our current situation and the Stone Age. Okay, so that there are flourishing ways forward, but they're very different from what we currently do, and we need hard conversations about how to navigate onto those different ways forward.
Thanks for those reflections, Barry. And if we're getting towards the end of our conversation now, so we're going to wrap up in the next few minutes. But if we had a word cloud for the chat, it would include things like trilemma, targets, action, robust conversations I added from the last one, you know, possibility, equity, and togetherness has come up a lot as well. Jan, from where you're sitting, and you're one of the top 25 influencers on energy. You're on social media a lot. You're tuned into the current conversations, and you've been involved in this one. Is there room for optimism here? You know, or are you pessimistic? Or is realism what we need? How would you reflect?
I think my job title on LinkedIn is Energy Transition Optimist. So I am optimistic. I think we have to be optimistic. I don't think pessimism is an option here. And I say that because of my kids and because of the world. You know, we got to be optimistic that we can solve this. You know, humans are pretty genius when it comes to finding solutions. You know, we've developed incredible technology. Lots of the solutions are already there. You know, we already have most of the technologies that we need to do this. And once you step away from, you know, looking just at the global picture and emissions going up, but you actually drill down a little bit and you look at specific examples, you find sources for optimism. I know lots of people who are more pessimistic will maybe cite Václav Smil, right, who says it takes centuries for energy transitions. This is never going to happen in time to meet any of the climate goals. But when you look at very specific technologies and how quickly they become adopted, you suddenly see a very different picture emerging. I mean, you may or may not like electric vehicles, but yeah, that's one of the technologies a lot of people think can at least make a significant reduction in terms of the emissions from transport. And just remembering where we were a decade ago with electric vehicles, the only mass market cars, I think, were the Nissan Leaf and the Tesla Model S, really. When you now look at the latest sales data, I don't know what it looks like in Ireland, but in lots of European countries, there's now a very sizable chunk of new sales, in some cases more than 50%, that are all electric vehicles. Unthinkable a decade ago. Sure, you know, vehicles are not the answer to everything. There are lots of questions. We could talk about city planning and walking and cycling and you know, public transport and all the rest of it. But just as an example, you can see how quickly an industry that was, you know, thought of as not moving very fast is moving at a very, very rapid pace, much faster than people would have thought. I think we see similar things in the heating space, which is something I look at a lot. Not everywhere, but in some countries, remarkable growth of clean heating technologies like heat pumps. more than a doubling in a single year in several countries. Poland last year, 120% growth in the heat pump market. Poland isn't typically thought of as a leader in the climate space. And the same for solar. When you look at the Netherlands, for example, per capita, the Netherlands are now very close to Australia. Huge success for the Dutch there. So when you look at examples, you find them. There isn't a single country that has figured all of this out. But when you start looking, you find that there are examples of doing this fast and doing it pretty well. And if the right people come together, it can be done. There are people in government who really want to change things. I know that, Jim, in your agency, that is the case for sure. There are people in industry who want to change things. And then there are lots of people who can make that happen all around these people. And I think if they all come together, you can actually make things happen pretty quickly. But yeah, we don't often get out of our silos, do we? And really think big and optimistic.
Thanks, Jan. We've seen some of those growth rates here in Ireland. We've had 150% growth in retrofits in the first 6 months of this year. We've had 200% growth rates in solar rooftop PV. EV sales at 20% of sales now, so we're seeing a lot of momentum. And even if the targets look stretch out into the future, the momentum here is very good. So we're certainly thinking about how we surf that wave. I like too that you talked about some of the different players in the various sectors. It's clear the technology is there. The experts are there. We're on this call. We're listening into this call. The research community is there. The policymakers are in place, and I fully agree, Jan. In our own agency, the EPA, certainly in the department, in DEC, from the minister all the way down through the public service, we see a lot of people really energized and looking for answers and constantly searching. In the research institutes like ESRI, third level research, where Barry's coming from, and we're following often the lead from Europe, but taking a lot of initiative here in Ireland as well. And then, of course, there's lots of active citizens and businesses across the country. The sustainable energy communities getting together and talking about this. So I think there's so much cause for optimism. And I think rather than looking at what's wrong, I want the last question for you all to be what might be missing in this context. You talked about solos, Jan. If I could just throw it to each of you, and if you picked one or two cohorts of society and thought, who needs to get together here a little bit more than they might be at the moment, maybe at the European level and international level, Claire and Jan, and maybe at the local level, Miriam and Barry. So which groups or which humans need to talk more to the other humans to sort of accelerate things here? Claire, could we start with you?
So this is a really interesting question, because Jan, I think, has mentioned like the research community, the experts, the policymakers, industry, and there are all important players there. I think we need to focus on those actors in society that people trust. And that means probably your local doctor, your teacher, your bus driver, the community stalwarts for the conversation. And actually, I circled a different keyword from what Barry said earlier. You circled robust conversations. I was like, honest. We need honest conversations. And I think that's even more important than them being robust, because if we have a space where we can be honest, that's very important. But at the European level, I seek young people and artists.
Excellent. Jan? Thanks, Claire.
It's a hard one to follow, I must say. I can't really name exactly who should meet and when, but what I can say is from personal experience, once you start the conversation and you meet with people across the globe and talk about these problems, you discover that, yes, the context is always very different, but there's so many similarities, and you learn something from those conversations, and you can take it to your local place, and it actually does make a big difference just having those conversations with people in other parts of the world. Just last week, I think I was talking to people in Australia and in Canada, completely different environments, politically, climatically, also historically, but similar problems in a way. And I think having more of those conversations across country boundaries is so helpful. And too often we circle in our insular kind of national debates, but when you look across the border, that can be very enriching indeed.
Thanks. And Barry?
I mean, everything that you said, Claire. A few years ago, I was part of a group that tried to encourage political parties to commit to a national conversation, an honest national conversation. And that led, well, that didn't directly lead, but eventually we got what was called the National Dialogue on Climate Change, which most people have never heard of. You stop a random person on the street, they'll look at you blank-faced. That wasn't what we were asking for. We were asking for something on a much bigger scale that would reach into every parish, every community over a period run for at least 2 years. Compared to the other things we're spending money on, this would be cheap. So I really think we do need that sort of conscious intervention to invite. You can't force people to participate, obviously, but to at least give an opportunity and an invitation to everybody in the country to meet with people that they can trust, and ask hard questions and explore their own roles, but also explore feeding that up to the national and international level. I think that international context that Jan mentioned is really, really important.
Thanks, Barry. And last word to Muireann.
So I was amused by Claire saying we need to kind of engage the people in the community whom people trust, because economists come way down on the list in terms of how much people trust us, unfortunately. So I guess I should shut up. But I think it's really important that we start talking to the behavioral scientists more. And SEAI has been fantastic in funding research into behavioral science. A really good example is congestion charging. There's massive status quo bias. Before congestion charging is introduced, everybody says they hate the idea. After congestion charging is introduced, it's super popular. We need to be talking to the behavioral scientists who will tell us who else we should talk to and how. I think we can learn lessons from COVID in how important, crucial behavioral science was, because for so long, the only weapon we had against COVID was our behavior. The main weapon we have against climate change is our behavior. So we need to start talking to the behavioral scientists, of whom I am not one, I hasten to add, but there are plenty of economists who do fantastic behavioral work, and we need to have them front and center, not just asking someone who's, interested, oh, we should run a behavioral or an informational campaign. No, we need to get actual evidence behind what works, what does change behavior. That would be my recommendation.
Thanks, Muireann. And thank you so much, Claire, Jan, Muireann, and Barry, for an absolutely riveting conversation. I'd love to grab a drink and continue. And we're inviting everyone on the call to do just that, I guess, is to continue to come together and to talk. So one of the overarching messages from our panel here today is that we have a lot more conversations and a lot more actions to take. And if we do it together, we'll certainly be stronger that way. So thanks very much to the panel. And for the last word on the conference today, I'm going to throw you to Irene Ward, Program Manager in our research team. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Irene.
Okay, and thanks, Jim, and to your panel, Dr. Jan Rosenow, Muireann Lynch, Professor Barry McMullen, and Professor Claire Dupont for your insights into what we can do to plan for the future of energy security in Ireland. It was welcome to see that key messages from the panel echoed those we heard throughout the day, such as approaches to the energy trilemma, the effectiveness of targets for net zero, and having politically achievable goals. Today, we have been delighted to be joined by an audience of interested citizens, researchers, and policymakers, businesses and communities to learn about how research can support our people, homes, businesses, and governments to deliver Ireland's energy revolution. As we have heard, energy security impacts all of us, and the current issues are too big to be solved in isolation. To reflect on the morning session, chaired by Margie McCarthy, we heard from Dr. Morgan Bazilian, Professor Claire Dupont, and Minister Eamon Ryan that the transformation is inevitable and a well-managed, well-governed and just transformation must be the preferred option. Links between the energy trilemma and the SDGs were introduced, and the importance of achieving the most effective approach. Sustainable supply chains, global interdependencies, and the importance of increasing renewable energy and reducing dependence on fossil fuels, as well as working towards net zero, were introduced. This was reinforced by presentations by Cathal O'Clery, Issy Petrie, and Vice Admiral Mark Mellett, as well as Justina Corcoran. In this session, the importance of energy affordability and the harmful effects on the most vulnerable were also stressed. In the research sprint, chaired by Kerry Sheehan, we heard from 6 diverse research projects who are working on solutions towards energy security. Here we saw the importance of gathering and sharing more data to inform research into renewables and inform policy. The importance of collaboration and working with a wide range of factors came through strongly. From Dr. Yamina Saheb and Matthias Sode, as well as Paul Bonnet-Blanc, we heard about opportunities for energy sufficiency policies in the EU and the importance of working with end users across disciplines and with other stakeholders for research and policy making. Recommendations were made for short summary documents to assist in the translation of research to policy. To summarise, key messages included: the time is now, transformation is inevitable, and a well-managed and collaborative approach is required. Data is required to make the best decisions, and decisions must be made on the availability at a point in time, but should be iterative to respond to new data and emerging trends. An enhanced grid that delivers efficiency, flexibility, and the stability with greater interconnection is required. We need to foster international engagement, discuss and develop best practice, and pool knowledge to develop solutions. We need to inspire each other. To solve wicked problems, we need joined up thinking across a wide range of stakeholders, including end users. There are lots of people who want and can facilitate change, and we need to work together. Momentum is growing and needs to be harnessed. The IEA Technology Collaboration Partnerships are a vehicle, as well as other research funding opportunities. We need system change and an integrated system approach. Supply chains are crucial, including using circular economy approaches. We need science-based decision-making. Further work is needed to meet the needs of vulnerable groups, which will require changes in system structures. We need approaches to bring people along based on trust and honesty. We heard from Murren about the importance of behavioural scientists. Increased research funding is key, and the importance of continuing and growing energy research to bridge the gap between where we are now and where we need to be. Finally, thank you to all our contributors today and to all the people who joined online. We hope you found the sessions informative and thought-provoking, and they have given you ideas on how we can all take part in climate action. Special thanks to the RDD team in SCAI, including Claire Guy for her organisation of the day, and ably supported by Joanne Fitzgerald and the rest of the team, including Louise O'Connor, Daniel O'Keefe and Truce Major Jack. Thanks to everyone else in SCAI who played a part, and to conference partners for hosting the platform. And it's just left for me to say thank you to everyone and enjoy your evening.